The word Aboriginal means first or earliest known, and has been used to describe Australia's Indigenous people. It is believed that they populated Australia at least 65,000 years ago and are recognized as the first Australian population. Almost all of them lived near a foreshore of a harbor, where they fished in the waters. They also hunted on land, picked food from bushes, and traded with other clans. Because they would move throughout their country in accordance with the seasons, the land provided them with more than enough resources to survive. This movement also resulted in a large amount of spare time, during which they developed a rich spiritual and cultural life. The cultural life centers around the belief in a dream time. The dream time is believed to be the very beginning. It is the story of how the people and the land were created by the spirits, the ancestors that created everything. Some widely known cultural examples that followed from this foundation are the didgeridoo and the dot art. In 77, James Cook arrived in Sydney and claimed the east coast of Australia for the United Kingdom. In 1788, Australia had between 350 and 750 distinct groupings, forming an estimated total population of 750,000 Aboriginal people. But after the invasion of the UK, the indigenous population had to deal with, until then, unknown diseases. Due to these new diseases, loss of land and direct violence to the Aboriginal population reduced to an estimated 90% between 1788 and 1900.
Due to the fact that the Indigenous people have been inhabiting the Australian land for more than 65,000 years, their history and culture holds an important part of the Australian identity. The horrible injustices that the Aboriginals experienced during the colonization and from the Australian government led to thousands of Aboriginals being forced to assimilate and adopt a new, white culture. For many of the children that were taken from their families as a result of the Stolen Generation tragedy, this assimilation meant that they were never given the opportunity to learn about their culture and heritage. In retrospect, the violent acts against Aboriginals have been recognized as inhumane. In 2008, the Australian Prime Minister and the Australian government formally apologized to the Indigenous people. The apology has been an important part of acknowledging the injustices performed by the Australian government and also of putting focus on understanding the Indigenous culture and history.
Even though valuable parts of Indigenous knowledge and languages have been lost, there has been a huge effort for and by the Indigenous people to regain their culture. Different Indigenous communities have come together to share their remaining knowledge. Since many of the people with this knowledge, culture, and language are starting to pass away, there has been, in the recent years, a rush to preserve this cultural heritage and pass it on to younger generations of Indigenous people. When it comes to how we build understanding about differences and commonalities in systems of knowledge and beliefs, one can consider the apology from the Australian Prime Minister and their government in 2008 as a vital first step. Another important step is to take time to really understand the culture of the Indigenous people and value it as part of the Australian society and identity.
Indigenous Australians still face many disadvantages in society, including poorer health, higher incarceration levels, lower levels of political representation, lower levels of education and employment, and racism throughout the Australian society. Rights for Indigenous people have increased over the years, but there are still many disparities that need to be addressed in order for them to have the same opportunities as non-Indigenous Australians. Today, there are a couple of popular ways to show respect to Indigenous people and acknowledge them as the first custodians of the land. These traditions are the Acknowledgement of Country and Welcome to Country ceremonies, which are traditionally used to recognize the Indigenous people's ongoing connection to their country. These practices have always been a part of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. Historically, crossing into another group's territory required a request. When the request was granted, there would be a ceremony welcoming the guests to their land and offering them safe passage. Though these practices have been around for thousands of years, they have been adapted to fit contemporary times. There are still two different ways that these traditions are used. A Welcome to Country ceremony is traditionally done at the beginning of formal events and is delivered by traditional owners or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have been given permission to welcome visitors to their country. In contrast, an acknowledgement of country can be done by anyone with the goal of showing respect for the traditional owners. These traditions are important because they recognize the connection that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have to their country and show respect to those who first inhabited the land.
Indigenous people have a strong connection to country. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are tied to land through paternal and maternal descent, in addition to tribal and language groups. There is never a conflict over ownership of land between groups. Each group was so strongly linked to their own territory that they did not desire anyone else's. Territory was defined both spiritually and physically. Landforms within these territories hold deep meaning, seen through past songs, stories, and dance, linking groups to their land further. Songlines, also known as a dreaming track, explain routes and paths followed by the creator, putting many different meaningful sights into place throughout song, dance, and art. Songlines are often what Aboriginal artists draw on for inspiration. Dreaming, or dreamtime, is an attempt to describe an Aboriginal concept. It is a big element to their identity and culture. It is learning, seeing, and being present with an open mind and an open heart. Dreaming stories are considered outside of time, not in the past. They engulf and give meaning to all that is around and beyond us. This concept is used to pass knowledge down generations through stories, song, and dance, and art, holding great responsibility and immense honor to continue tradition. Dreaming or dreamtime is the English attempt at describing this dense concept. Within Australia, there are different words used to describe this concept. Some prefer dreaming versus dreamtime. Although Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people obey Australian laws, in addition they have their own complex set of beliefs that coexist with today's. Most of these laws concern leadership and etiquette, property, special events such as marriage and death, and sacred knowledge. Spearing used to be one of the most popular ways to enforce tribal laws. Aboriginal spirituality is totemic. A totem can be an object, plant, or animal, inherited to be a spiritual emblem by members of a clan or family. Totems tend to define both people's roles in society as well as their relationships with others in their surrounding world. Language is very important to Indigenous current culture and history. According to the National Indigenous Languages Survey conducted in 2005, there are said to be about 250 Aboriginal languages in Australia when the Europeans first arrived. However, today only 145 still remain and are still spoken. Yet, only 18 are still strongly used by all ages. Language is very important due to the fact that most history is passed down orally. Thus, losing just one language entails losing a wealth of knowledge and different perspectives of those who spoke it, never mind losing hundreds.
We've learned a little bit about it. I know about like the general practice of acknowledging your country. It happened during our orientation at USID. I haven't met a lot of Aboriginals though. I met one in passing, I think. That's about it.
I've encountered art in museums and I've seen some street performers near the Opera House.
Since I've been abroad, the most prominent thing I've realized is my professors giving an acknowledgement to country at the beginning of lecture.
Well, when we arrived in Australia through our study abroad program, they had an Indigenous professor actually come talk to us about all the history behind it. So, and during all our orientations, we did acknowledgements to the land. So I knew it was obviously very important to the culture of Australia, and I see the flags hanging up on campus. But yeah, I'd love to learn more about it.
I'm aware of how relevant it is in Australia right now, that it's a huge movement in the general realm of social justice. I see like signage on the streets for it about what it means to be an Australian, and a big part of that relates to the Indigenous peoples as well as all the immigrants. And yeah, we've learned a little bit about it in like orientations. So
I've only learned about the European settlers and more like the history and background, but I'm pretty unaware of the current situation with inequality.
Personally, I haven't experienced anything firsthand, but I am aware that there is a lot of social inequality between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people.
So I've only actually, other than the professor who presented us, seen one Indigenous person in Australia. She did seem less fortunate, and I think that just shows that there's a systematic inequality between the settlers in Australia and the Indigenous people. But that's about all I've seen of it because I haven't interacted with many Indigenous Australians.